With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Situation Room right here on Tactics. We certainly welcome all of you, whether you're joining us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, Periscope. By the way, just a heads up, we are broadcasting on Facebook right now, but it looks as though we may have some connectivity issues. I was just notified by our streaming service about that, so if we all of a sudden drop out on you, we apologize. Not really something we can control, but you can always check us out on YouTube, Periscope, or Twitch if that takes place. So if you're on either Facebook or Twitter, because Twitter draws from Facebook, at least the way that we do it, if that happens, just skip on over to our YouTube channel. That's the easiest way to get to us, and we will still continue to be live streaming there. There should be no issues with any of our other sites. It's just specifically Facebook that seems to be having some issues right now. So hopefully that is something that will not be a big problem. But thank you so much for being with us. It is, as always, a pleasure to be with you. I know it's a little unusual that we're having a show on Friday, but what happened is we were having some internet issues yesterday as well. Hopefully they're better now. But because we were having some issues over here at Faulkner with the internet connection, obviously kind of hard to live stream if you don't have internet. So we decided, since we were having so many issues, that it was just best to just not deal with it yesterday. And since the show was going to be starting late anyway, it didn't make sense to kill ourselves trying to throw a show together. So we are with you today, and it actually turns out it's probably a good thing that we waited, because we have quite a bit of Alabama news, and most of it broke today. So the fact that we're actually here on a Friday, hopefully it's not inconvenient for anybody, but we do actually have more news than we would have had normally, just because there were a couple of big stories. And one of those stories is, I think that Doug Jones has made it his goal to be the most unpopular man in the state of Alabama. That seems to be something that he's shooting for. I'm not sure exactly why, but Doug Jones seems to be bound and determined to try to do the absolute dead level best that he can to get his approval rating in the can before he leaves. And I think maybe what's going on is that Doug Jones realizes he has virtually no chance of winning this thing. The only possibility, you would think that now that Roy Moore's in the race, that he would at least start acting up, or at least starting to straighten up and fly right just a little bit, because there's at least a chance that he can get elected. But it seems to me, and I made this observation months ago, that Doug Jones has essentially determined, look, there's nothing I can do to win this race. My seat is done anyway, so I might as well do as much damage as humanly possible. I might as well push my agenda as much as I can while I'm here. And maybe there's at least a little sense of that attitude from George Costanza in Seinfeld. You may remember that he had that brief stint with the Mets, and George Costanza, of course, worked for the Yankees, and the Mets said, look, the thing is, legally, and according to the league rules, we can't actually seek you, but we want you. We want you to come work for the Mets. And he was going to have a nicer job. I guess they were going to pay him a little better. And so what George did was, so that they could ask him to join their team, he had to get fired from the Yankees. And he figured, well, if I'm trying to get fired intentionally, I might as well go all out. And he's making this observation, and Jerry, he's doing all these crazy things to try to get fired. And Jerry just says, why don't you just make it a point to try to get fired, do it in a simple way? And he's like, no, it's got to be elaborate. And so he does things like shows up at one of the meetings in Lou Gehrig's uniform, like the actual Lou Gehrig Yankees uniform. No, that was Steinbrenner. He shows up in Babe Ruth. He shows up in Babe Ruth's uniform to a meeting, and pulls out a meatball sub, and a meatball goes right down the jersey. And so he does that, and then at one point he takes one of their World Series trophies and ties it up to the back of his car and rides around in the parking lot with a bullhorn yelling, "Your achievements mean nothing!" Stuff like that. And what's so hilarious is no matter what he does, he can't seem to get fired. And that's, I think, kind of what is going on with Doug Jones. Because just like George Costanza told Jerry, I think maybe Doug Jones is going, no, I don't just want to lose this election. I want people to look at my election and go, wow, that guy got canned. Maybe that is what Doug Jones is doing right now, but it seems as though he is absolutely dead set. His mind is solely focused on trying to make sure that he loses this election in spectacular fashion, and he's doing a fantastic job of it. For example, he actually earlier doubled down on the citizenship question. So I want you to go ahead and first of all think about the absurdity of this. The citizenship question has been a part of the United States Census for maybe not as long as the census has been going on, but for certain in recent memory. For sure, my entire lifetime, probably the entire lifetime of my parents and grandparents, there has been a question on the U.S. Census about whether or not you were a citizen. Guess why it's not there anymore? Because President Barack Obama took it off. And just like so many things that Barack Obama did, when Donald Trump tries to undo them, the courts say, no, and waggle their little finger at him. They did this with DACA, for example. They're saying, you can't undo DACA, but President Obama is the one that signed DACA into law. It's an executive order, and part of it being an executive order is the executive, which would be Trump, has the authority to overturn it. And so the courts have a very strange precedent with Trump that they seem to apply a standard to him that they don't apply to anybody else, which is, well, yes, a president can undo an executive order by another president, except when we don't like it. And that's not a power of the court system. It's not a power of the federal judiciary. It's not a power of the Supreme Court even. The Supreme Court cannot just say, well, we don't like the fact that you want to overturn this executive order, therefore you can't. That's not the way this works. If you are an executive, if you are the President of the United States, you have a right to write new executive orders and undo previous ones. Now, your power in executive orders themselves is not unlimited, obviously, but the point is, you certainly have the power to undo the executive orders of your predecessors because you are now in control of the executive branch. That would be almost like the Congress passing a bill and having the president sign it into law, and then 2-3 years later, when the makeup of the Congress is different, Congress passes another bill repealing the law of the previous law that Congress passed, and the president approves of the repeal of that law, and then the court saying, no, you can't do that. Well, you can't have a standard to where you can't repeal a law by doing the same thing, in other words, engaging in the same political process that you used to pass it. That doesn't make any sense. The judiciary is not a law-making branch. That's not their job. And so the courts are severely overreaching in a number of ways, and even though I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this is a side path, they've done the same thing this week, not only with the censorship question, but also, and we'll get to this a little bit later, the question of whether or not Trump can even block people on Twitter. Now, that's not really a question of executive power. It's a completely different legal question. But the point is, the courts seem to have a special animosity that they reserve specifically for Trump and rule against him in ways that they would never rule against another president. And I really get annoyed. When I see other talk show hosts, other conservative personalities or thinkers that say Trump is the only one that this has ever happened to, because normally it's not true, and normally they're doing it specifically to try to drum up some kind of hysteria that this is completely unprecedented, this is only happening to Trump. In this case, it's actually true. I do not ever remember, and I'm not just going from my own personal memory, I mean going back in history, a court that seemed more absolutely dead set on neutering, for lack of a better way to describe it, taking out all of the executive power from the executive branch. I don't remember this ever happening in U.S. history, that where the judiciary decided to take it upon themselves to do everything they could to stymie an administration at every turn, which is also incredibly surprising considering the general mild-mannered nature of most of Trump's executive orders. But nonetheless, where this ties into Doug Jones is that he has now doubled down on his stance on the citizenship question. So for those of you who don't know, just a little bit of background, SCOTUS did hand down a very narrow 5-4 ruling against the censorship question being reapplied, not applied, reapplied to the United States Census. And essentially what that opinion said was it ruled that it was constitutional, which is accurate. They're saying there's nothing unconstitutional, because that was part of the argument, actually, that it's unconstitutional for you to ask this. And they said, no, it's definitely not unconstitutional. And then they also ruled that there was an authoritative acceptability. In other words, the executive branch does indeed have power to ask this question. It is to the discretion of the executive branch. But the reason that it was overturned, the reason that it was ruled against, is they said, basically, procedurally, it's incorrect. And Roberts' rationale on that, which honestly, even though I'm annoyed by Roberts and I'm annoyed by this ruling, I'm not sure that it's entirely wrong. And I know that there are people that are upset at me for saying this, but stay with me here. I do have a place that I'm going with this. There does seem to be at least a monicum of consistency with this. So essentially what he's saying is, I'm getting conflicting stories as to why it was being reapplied. In other words, I'm hearing one thing from this legal argument and another thing from this legal argument as to the rationale to why it is being added, why it is being justified, which the executive branch does not need to justify everything that it does to the judiciary anyway. If there is a reason to believe that something the executive branch has done that is unconstitutional or illegal, in other words, outside of their realm of authority, outside of the power granted to the executive by the Constitution, then yes, absolutely, then they have to run that by the judiciary. There needs to be somebody that brings up a case if that situation arises, and then the court has some oversight. Yes, that is the constitutionally prescribed power structure there. But it's not as though that every time the executive branch wipes its nose, that the judiciary needs to be there to approve and nod yes or no. That's not the way the system is supposed to work. And what's odd about this is they have already ruled, yes, it's constitutional, yes, he has the authority to do it. But procedurally, I'm getting conflicting messages. Now, from a legal perspective, I understand why that's troublesome, because you don't want people making arguments that seem to conflict with each other or to get two different stories from the same administration on the same legal side. It's odd, it's suspicious, and I think that especially in a normal courtroom setting, Roberts is not completely unfounded in thinking that that's odd. And Roberts is basically handing open or giving instructions on, okay, you can win this, and basically laying out a roadmap, this is how you get there. But the point is, the idea that the executive branch has to essentially run it by the court system to make sure the thing that they're doing is okay is really strange anyway. It's certainly not a constitutional idea, especially when the court specifically has already said, no, they have the authority to do it and it's constitutional. They're not breaching the law. They're not breaching their own power or authority. So it's an odd decision, but Doug Jones decided that he was going to comment on this as well. We'll go ahead and look at his interview right now. This is Doug Jones, I believe, on MSNBC.
I want to get your reaction to the news that the president will use some sort of executive action to add a citizenship question to the census. What, if anything, should Congress do about that?
Well, I don't think it should be Congress. I think it should be the courts. He is, in effect, I think, just flouting a court order that happened the other day. The courts gave him some authority to try to come back with a reason, but they didn't say just go ahead and do it by yourself. I don't know if obviously this is an issue that Congress will take up, but more importantly, I think it's contempt of the court system. And it is a continuing pattern in this administration that, I'm just going to get what I want and to with everybody else. It doesn't matter what Congress says. It doesn't matter what the courts say. Where I think that this needs to be addressed is in the court system, because they have addressed it first. There is an order out there. There's a decision out there, and he needs to abide by it.
Well, again, the problem with that is, can you even make the case that by doing this, he's not abiding by the court's decision? This is where you get into a really odd legal argument, because I just laid out the case for why you could even make the case that Trump is abiding by the court system. He's saying that because they already said it's constitutional, has the authority to do it. Basically, the only problem that they had was the reason was wrong. It was thrown out because of procedural issues, which you could have just as easily used to justify ruling 5-4 the other direction and say, okay, procedurally it's incorrect, but there's not an issue here because it's constitutional and he's within his authority to do so. And so in this particular way, changing course here, I don't necessarily think is an issue. And Doug Jones' assertion essentially that Donald Trump would be in contempt of court, he would be showing contempt of the court system, which, to be honest, taking the legalese out of it for a second, I think Donald Trump actually does have contempt for the court system. I think anybody that's listened to him talk about the courts would agree with that. There's times where I have contempt of the court system, but nonetheless, when it comes to Donald Trump, I do think that doing this wouldn't necessarily be even a rebellion against the court based on the way that they ruled. If he's using an executive action, in other words, using a different method to get there, and then you know what's going to happen. Because as soon as he throws down that executive action, there's going to be somebody else that tries to take him to court again, and then it works its way up through the court system, and then you have the Supreme Court look at it, and then they rule in the other direction as long as they get their ducks in a row and give the same reason this time. So I don't see how doing the executive action would be any different than them going through the court system through the front door. You're going to get the same effect either way. And so I really don't see what the problem is here. But the larger issue, I think, and this is something that we know that the Democrats, they would never hold themselves to this standard. But the problem is that the Democrats sort of have this mindset that they need to run it by Congress and run it by the judicial system. Well, no, the court literally just decided this is the executive branch. It's within their authority to do so. That was part of this decision. But Doug Jones seems to keep trying to pull back, and I think he did correctly say that it's not really a question for Congress. He was right on that part. But he's saying we got to run it by the court system again. No, the court system itself is deciding that is something that is really more of a question for them. And here's an important thing to note about this too. Separation of powers, checks and balances, is a hallmark of our judiciary system. It's the reason we have the three separate branches. And here's the thing. One of the checks, certainly not the only check, but one of the checks that the executive branch has on the legislature is that they're in charge of the census, which determines where the seats are and how many of them they are. It helps determine the House, which is 1/2 of Congress. It's a small check. It's not as big a check as, for example, the veto. But the point is, it is a part of establishing and maintaining the executive power. And so that's really where I think Doug Jones actually does get this at least partially right, and the host there at MSNBC gets it wrong. The reason the host at MSNBC wants it is because she's saying, okay, well, then Congress needs to decide. Read your Constitution. This is not a question for Congress. Congress doesn't need to get involved. If Congress gets involved, if Congress has a say in this, then that is Congress having a say in how one of the checks against Congress works. You understand? That would be like giving the prisoner, not to say that Congress should be in prison, although some of them probably should be, but it would be like if Congress were in prison, that would be like the guard handing the prisoner the key to his door. You don't give Congress power over its own check that the executive branch is supposed to have over it. The imbalance of power in our branches is one of the big problems that we have in our system right now anyway, that Congress has essentially unbalanced that power themselves by legislating away their own duties. But the point here is, and that's really where we need to emphasize this, that Congress certainly, even Doug Jones is saying, no, Congress does not need to be a part of this. But the idea that the president must run all of this by the judiciary and get their permission and their blessing to exercise a power that is contained within his own office, that the Constitution grants the executive branch in Article 2, that's absurd. And I think that anybody that is objectively looking at this would say that it's absurd. Nobody, when President Barack Obama removed that question from the census, said, you know what, we really need to ask Congress about it. We really need to add the judiciary about it. Keep in mind, I was no fan of Barack Obama's executive orders. And when he removed the citizen question from the census, I didn't like it, but I didn't think that it was up to the courts or up to the Congress to change it. He is the duly elected president of the United States. He was in 2010. As such, that was his prerogative. Didn't like it, thought it was a bad idea, still his prerogative. That's not something that Congress or the courts are supposed to get involved in. But Jones also criticized this week, so on a completely separate issue, Senator Jones was criticizing Republican healthcare policy. So I want to go ahead and read this to you. This was took place in a conference call. He said, certainly you had repeal. What's interesting about those is you don't have replace. You've got nothing. That's the biggest problem that we have here. Now, I know that this is really going to shock some people, but you know what? Doug Jones is 100% right. I know that surprises some people, but Doug Jones is right about that. What we saw was a bunch of Republicans running on the ticket, we've got to repeal Obamacare, we've got to repeal and replace, we've got to repeal and replace, we've got to repeal and replace. And then people would ask them, okay, what are you going to replace it with? And they didn't have an answer. Now, the reason that they didn't have an answer was because of one of two reasons. And I think that it was different based on which member of Congress you were asking. There were some people that didn't have an answer because they were ill-prepared and they had no idea what they were going to replace it with. They were just saying it to try to drum up votes and had not gone through the actual legwork of coming up with a replacement plan. But there's another subset that had a plan but didn't want to reveal it because they knew the plan was stupid. You see, for a lot of them, what they wanted to replace it with was more crony capitalism. Because Obamacare is a weird hodgepodge of socialism and crony capitalism. And part of the reason that it failed so quickly and the reason that it was designed to fail, and we know that from the architect of Obamacare, Jonathan Gruber, and we know it even from President Barack Obama, that the whole thing was designed to collapse on itself. That when you're looking back at Obamacare and looking at what it is, it's this weird mesh of socialism and capitalism that was never supposed to work in the first place. And when I say capitalism, not real free market capitalism, crony capitalism. In other words, giving big kickbacks and trying to protect the insurance companies, trying to protect the drug companies. The reason that the medical industry, in the form of insurance companies and in the form of big pharma, the reason that a lot of those guys supported it is because it was specifically done to protect their power and was going to, in their mind, make them a lot of money. It didn't wind up panning out exactly the way that they thought it would, but the bill was specifically designed in such a way that they're saying, look, you have guaranteed profits, and if you fall apart, if you're not making as much as you thought you were going to make, the government's going to pay you anyway. We're going to bail you out if the system doesn't work. That was an actual promise in Obamacare, and that's the way that they got Big Pharma and they got the insurance companies behind it. And so the reason that a lot of those Republican lawmakers did not want to say, I'm going to repeal it and I'm going to replace it with X is because their plan for X was we're going to give more taxpayer money to the companies. We have buddies in the Department of Crony Capitalism, the Chamber of Commerce, as it were. We've got a whole bunch of buddies and big donors there, and we want to give them a lot of taxpayer money, and that's our plan. We're going to take out the individual mandate. We're going to take out some of this other stuff, and what we're going to replace it with is lots and lots of taxpayer money going to the big companies that give us lots of money. That was their plan. And they didn't want to say that. And that's why they didn't bring it up. So you had two different groups of Republican congressmen, the ones that had the plan but knew that their plan was going to be extremely unpopular, and that's why they didn't say it, and the ones that really didn't have a plan. And that's the reason that Doug Jones is 100% accurate in saying that they didn't have a backup. They were not willing to articulate what their plan was. That's really where it all goes back to. Because the truth is, when it's all said and done, as much as we complain about the Democrats, as much as we complain about Obamacare, and should, it's important to remember that the reason we still have Obamacare, the reason it's still in place is because at the end of the day, Republicans still want Obamacare. They may want a different form of it. They may want a version of it that gives more money to their donors or puts more money back in their pocket, sort of by extension. But the truth is they want Obamacare. They like big government. They like controlling a giant chunk of the medical industry and would control all of it if they could. Because progressivism is a cancer that is growing in both parties. They want the power. They want the influence. They want to be able to control a person's health care. And because of that, they wanted to repeal and replace. You see, what the slogan should have been all this time is repeal and repeal. And Doug Jones actually had said that before. Doug Jones, what was that, a couple months ago, where he said, repeal and replace is a political slogan. It's not something that's workable. He's 100% right. Doug Jones is 100% right on that. And I did not think I would ever say Doug Jones is right this often in a single segment. Repeal and replace was nothing but political gamesmanship. It was nothing but, hey, vote for me, I'll get rid of Obamacare and I'll replace it with somebody. They were trying to tell people, you can have your cake and eat it too. We're still going to give you free health care, but we're going to get rid of Obamacare. Well, what are you going to replace it with? Other Obamacare. We're going to replace it with Obamacare that's under a different name. We're going to give you McConnell Care or Ryan Care. That was the plan from the beginning. They had no intention of giving up their own power. They had no intention of rolling it back, letting the free market do its thing, and just sitting back and watching what happens. They had every intention of, if they repealed Obamacare, and I never believed that they would, and it turns out, unfortunately, that I was correct, that if they repealed Obamacare, what was going to replace it was a version of Obamacare that benefited a lot of their buddies. And we didn't even get that, actually. Not that that would have been an improvement, but that's not even what we got. When the Republicans had the House and the Senate and the presidency, they still didn't repeal Obamacare. Had the chance, had 2 years, still didn't do it. They repealed one tiny, tiny sliver, literally like a couple of sentences out of 2,000 pages, and then tell us, yeah, we got rid of Obamacare. It's not true. The current system we have is still Obamacare. And the only reason they said that is because they were trying to get people to vote for him. Jones, I hate to say it, but Jones' assessment of that is 100% correct. But now here's where he and I differ, because he also said this in that same conference call. I cannot emphasize enough how much this lawsuit, in other words, the lawsuit trying to get Obamacare overturned, how much this lawsuit would hurt people who rely on health care coverage and made it possible by this law. So essentially, what the lawsuit would do is, instead of repeal and replace, or even repealing per se, it would mean the courts are the ones that strike down Obamacare wholesale. They get rid of the whole thing. It all goes away and defaults back to what we had in 2009. So 2009, the healthcare system we had then, that's what it would default back to. It would be like Obamacare never happened. That's how we would treat it. because of the way that the lawsuit is worded and the way that it would be struck down. Hopefully it happens, because 2009 would be a vast improvement over what we have now. Is it what we actually need to do? No, because instead of repeal and replace, we should have said repeal and repeal. The healthcare system was broken in 2009. And that's the reason that they were able to sell Obamacare to a lot of people. Everybody knew our healthcare system was broken. It wasn't perfect then. And a lot of the problem was the exact thing that Obamacare did. It was chock full of crony capitalism, overregulation, things that didn't make any sense. That's really what we were going on with. We didn't have a free market healthcare system. Granted, we had a much more free market healthcare system than any other place in the world that had socialized medicine, but it still was not a free market solution. We still did not have a real free market where people had competition. They had to look at competitive pricing. They were able to move with their insurance if they wanted to. There was so much regulation. There was so much red tape that was bogging it down. Was it better than everywhere else in the world? Yeah. And frankly, even with Obamacare, it still is. It's not even close. But the point is, it was broken then, and what we should have said is, we're going to repeal it, and we're going to fix the way it was back in 2009. We're going to get rid of this government red tape, get rid of the regulation, let the free market do its thing. That should have been the answer. And you can even have specific policy reforms that do that. Rand Paul, perfect example. Some of Rand Paul's proposals about having group coverage to where it's not tied to your workplace and where you can move around, and they would be more encouraged to look for competitive pricing on things like drugs and treatment, and having the healthcare savings accounts that are tax-free. All of that stuff, I mean, phenomenal plans. But the point is, we had to repeal that and repeal the other stuff that was bogging down the system in the first place. So getting rid of ACA, getting rid of Obamacare, unlike what Doug Jones is saying, would be a positive. But it's not as big a step in the right direction as it should have been. It's a big step backwards, which is what we needed. But we needed more than that. We needed to repeal and then repeal some more. So Doug Jones actually, his seat is the one that is most likely to flip according to the Washington Post, and that should come as no surprise. I mean, saying stuff like this just proves that. You look at the way that Obamacare negatively affected premiums. We were told that it was going to save the average family of four $2,500 a year, when in actuality premiums have actually gone up since it was implemented in 2014 by about $2,000. So he was only $4,500 off in terms of savings. Instead of saving money, we actually wound up losing $2,000 a year. So that was the way. That's a change just between 2009 and now. So I don't see what Doug Jones is saying about, oh, it would hurt families if this lawsuit goes through. No, monetarily looking at it, you couldn't be further from the truth. Don't you think the average family would love to have don't you think that the average family would love to have that $2,000 back? Just defaulting back to 2009 is certainly not a permanent solution. It certainly wouldn't be ideal. But just getting rid of it and going back to the 2009 system is way better than what we've got now. And that's one other thing that I'll say real quick before we move on. Whenever the Democrats, Doug Jones or anybody else, starts telling you about how broken our healthcare system is and how much work there is to do and how we've got to overhaul it, I want you to remember this. The healthcare system that they are criticizing, the healthcare system that they are talking about, is Obamacare. So when you've got people like Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris getting on national TV and talking about how horrible our healthcare system is and how broken it is and how we need to reform it, ask them, then why did you vote for Obamacare? Because that is the system that is currently in place. That is the system that we have right now. And if you're the one that's bashing it, you're the one that's saying how many problems we have and what we're going to do about it, why'd you vote for Obamacare? Because you voted for this current system. The only way to explain how they constantly get let off the hook for that is people in the media not wanting to press them with hard questions. Because anybody with a modicum of common sense that's a host would say, follow up that when they start talking about how broken the system is. Whether it's Bernie Sanders or anybody else, just ask them, well, then why'd you vote for it? You voted for the system we have right now. If your problem is it's so broken now, why didn't you vote against it back then, or at least propose some amendments to improve it? But unfortunately, the media does not function like that because they are not going to be critical of the people that they want to unseat Donald Trump. That is mission number one in their eyes. But all this goes back to what I've been saying for a while now. Doug Jones is not trying very hard to win this race. I think that he knows that the odds of him winning that race are practically non-existent, and because of that, what Doug Jones is doing now is he is trying to curry favor with the DNC and trying to get on with them at some point. I don't know if he's bucking for a vice presidency, probably not a vice presidency, something much lower like a cabinet position in the next Democrat presidential cabinet if they ever have one. You know, whether it's 2020 or 2024, he's trying to be a mover and shaker at the national level because he knows that his odds of doing much in the state of Alabama, the state he currently resides, is practically non-existent. And so if he can get into the good graces of the bigwigs at the DNC, he knows that he has a better chance of doing something up at the national level because the odds of him being a senator again are very, very low unless Roy Moore becomes the primary candidate he has to face. Or sorry, Roy Moore becomes the general candidate he has to face. Or the only other way that he stays in it at the national level, other than getting some kind of cushy job from another Democrat at the national level, is if he's able to move to a different state. Those are his only options. And so I think that Doug Jones' strategy is just to ingratiate himself to the Democrats as much as possible and make hay while the sun shines. But speaking of Alabama politics, Tommy Tuberville actually had an interview earlier today where he went after Paul Ryan. So former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. And he was doing an interview on WVNN when the border came up, which, timely topic, perfectly understandable that they wanted to talk about that. And here's what he said. Trump inherited this problem because our politicians have just absolutely dropped the ball. And I'm really disgusted with Paul Ryan because he had a chance to help put this border wall up and stop this mess. All right, so here's the thing about Tuberville's statement. Is what Tuberville is saying about Paul Ryan philosophically true? I think that's fair to say. I think it's fair to say that Paul Ryan did not make getting the border wall up and getting funding for it a huge priority for the House. And it doesn't make any sense to me why he wouldn't. He had a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican president. But the point is, Paul Ryan did not necessarily make it a priority and was not particularly good at rallying the troops, herding all the cats into a single direction, and getting it to where they would vote in favor of such funding. But it's not technically true. And here's why. There is some truth to it. Because basically what Tuberville is saying is Paul Ryan didn't do his job, didn't support the president, and didn't get the funding that he needed for the border wall. But the thing is, the House did pass funding for $4.6 billion for the wall. Now, it's not as much as Trump wanted. Trump specifically asked for $14 billion. And Paul Ryan came about $10 billion short. So, that's not necessarily what Trump wanted. But the point is, Paul Ryan did pass some funding for the border, and he did make it a point to get that on the agenda, get enough Republicans to vote for it, and get it to pass. So, did Paul Ryan succeed perfectly? No, but he did something. I mean, he didn't get an A+ on his report card, but he got a C+. We certainly wanted better, but it's not like Paul Ryan did nothing. So even though I'm not a fan of Paul Ryan either, I think that the guy did a horrible job as Speaker of the House. I don't think that you can lay it all on Paul Ryan's feet, because the reason that funding didn't go through had nothing to do with Paul Ryan. It was because the Senate Republicans couldn't agree on it and couldn't push it through without somebody either voting more conservatively than they normally do in the form of, for example, Lisa Murkowski or John McCain. Actually, by the time this came up, I believe that was after John McCain was no longer voting. So I have to rescind that. I believe it would have been Murkowski or Collins. But regardless, the point still remains unchanged that they couldn't get it through in the Senate. That's not Paul Ryan's fault. Is it Paul Ryan's fault that they didn't get a $14 billion spending for it? Yeah, that's on him. But the fact that the border wall wound up with virtually no spending, that's not on Paul Ryan. And so while Tuberville is philosophically correct in the sense that Paul Ryan was not somebody that did the best that he could to get this funding through and didn't succeed in everything that he set out to do, it's certainly the case, I think it's certainly fair to say, that Paul Ryan was not the incompetent moron that Tuberville tries to make him out to be. But the problem with this is, it's not even necessarily that he got it technically wrong. Because when it comes to fact-checking this, if we were doing it by the Washington Post fact-checker, for example, this would not be like a 4 Pinocchio situation. It would be a 1 or 2. Because is Tuberville wrong? Technically, yes, but in some kind of sense, you can kind of see where he arrived at that. The bigger problem is that Tuberville has been basically a very effective cheerleader for Donald Trump and nothing else. He's not somebody that brings things of his own to the table, doesn't have his own ideas. He's basically an empty shell, and what he has filled that shell with is, I like Trump. That has been his only message from the beginning of this entire campaign. And granted, he's in Alabama. It's a very pro-Trump state. Maybe yelling, I like Trump, over and over again is going to be something that gets him in office. Maybe. He certainly has the name recognition for it. But the point is, and this is what really disgusts me about the whole thing, and I don't hate Tuberville. I think he's a good man, really like him. I was a fan of his in the sports realm, and I was a fan of his in the way that he ran his program. I really like him. I respect him. I think he's a moral, good guy. But the problem is, can he ever say anything of substance at all? And I think maybe his political advisors are seeing a phenomenon that people are all too familiar with. Right now, the thing that people want to hear is one of two things. The vast majority of people, not everybody, but the vast majority of people want to hear one of two messages. Either Orange Man bad, if you're on the left, or Cheeto Jesus saves, on the right. That seems to be the only two messages anybody has any interest whatsoever in hearing. You either treat Trump as though he is Adolf Hitler himself, or you treat him as though he is the second coming of Christ. And there is no middle ground. Anybody that is saying anything moderately in between, anybody that is just calling balls and strikes, winds up getting washed away in the noise, getting completely drowned out. And I try to call balls and strikes. Sometimes it wins me friends, sometimes it doesn't. And that's just the way it goes, but I'm not going to change that because it's what I really believe. And honestly, I think people pumping the two messages I just talked about, that they probably really believe that too. But it bothers me that there are so many people, and the way that our political structure, the way that our political climate has changed in this country now, is that nobody, seemingly, or at least not enough people, certainly, are willing to hear anything other than either Cheeto Jesus saves or Orange Man bad. That seems to be the only thing people have interest in. And I think Tuberville's political advisors are seeing this and saying, well, obviously, in this state, Cheeto Jesus saves is the message to go with, and that is all Tuberville has said. We haven't heard anything specific on policy. He doesn't really seem to know anything about the issues, and this shows a pretty solid lack of information when it comes to history. Now, is he an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who just says stupid things that are blatantly untrue when it comes to basic civics? No, Tuberville doesn't do that. But he certainly doesn't seem to have the level of knowledge and expertise when it comes to some of the specific policy issues, especially when you consider some of the other candidates that are available. I mean, you could go with somebody that Tuberville and say, well, Tuberville's certainly better than Doug Jones, and yes, amen, he is. But when you've got other people that actually have some experience and know what they're talking about, do you really want to go with the guy that all he knows what to do is say, well, I like Trump? I'm telling you, you look through his interviews, he doesn't say anything else. Every word out of Tuberville's mouth can be distilled down to, I like Trump, I support Trump. He doesn't say anything of actual substance. And I get that there are some people that are going to be angry, you're going to hear the pitchfork squad come out, that, you know, people in the state of Alabama that worship Trump as though he's a god. Those people are going to come out against people like Bradley Byrne that have at times, even though normally he votes with the president, occasionally criticizes him or occasionally says, no, I want to go a different direction. And it amazes me that the same people that would be furious and frustrated with people on the left that basically say conform or die will say exactly the same thing, conform to the Trump agenda or die. That's really the issue that I've got with Tuberville. I hope that he can change this, but for so many people, politics has turned into sports. And Tuberville knows sports. For so many people, what politics has become is, I'm putting on the jersey. I'm either putting on my MAGA hat or putting on my Clinton 2016 shirt, and whatever my side does is great. Anything the other side does is horrible, and that's the way that I think. When you're talking about a sports team, that's okay. When it comes to baseball, I may be critical of my Braves occasionally. I may not like some coaching decisions every now and then. But when it comes to the Braves, which, by the way, appear on News Radio 1440, we're the Montgomery home for the Braves. When it comes to the Braves, I support my team no matter what. Politics isn't like that, or at least it shouldn't be. Unfortunately, Tuberville is still thinking about this like being a football coach. When he was the coach at Auburn, you didn't say anything bad about your team. You didn't criticize them because that's your team. But that's not the way that politics is supposed to work. I want free thinkers. I want people that challenge preconceived notions. I want people that when an administration does something dumb, acts as an actual check against it. That's part of Congress's job. I don't want a yes man. And unfortunately, so far, Tuberville has proven that's all that he is. We'll take a break and we'll be back in just a minute.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
Hey everybody, it's Caleb here, and I was just driving through South Alabama. I had a couple quick thoughts that I'd like to share with you. First of all, I really love it when the environmentalists tell us that there just are not enough trees, that we're killing all the trees, that there are no trees out there. As you can probably see through the window there, South Alabama is just trees. There's virtually nothing. You got maybe Andalusia, Enterprise, and Dothan, and trees, and that's pretty much it, other than Gulf Shores, which is the beach. So I genuinely believe that it should be part of our criminal justice system that any liberal that whines too much about there not being enough trees, that their sentence, their punishment for that, should be to drive through South Alabama, because they will be immediately disillusioned about this idea that there are just not enough trees left in the world. There is nothing but trees for miles and miles and miles and miles. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, and it actually made me hearken back to a comment that was made, I would say a few months ago, by Hillary Clinton, talking about how the coast, in other words, the people in California and Oregon and Washington and then New England, that they all voted for her and everybody else voted for Trump, which, you know, is true. And then she also talks about trying to essentially explain why that is. She says that, well, all the dynamic people, all the movers and shakers and the people that are making money, those are the ones that voted for me. It was the neophytes, the little people over in flyover country that voted for Trump. And goodness knows that I'm not the world's biggest Trump supporter. I didn't even vote for the guy in the first election. But one of the reasons that she lost that election in the first place, and one of the reasons that Americans in general are just so tired of that, is because there is a large contingency of the left that genuinely believes that only people in the cities are the ones that are dynamic and important. And I'm driving through South Alabama, and right now it's mostly just trees, but especially when you get a little bit further north. I was driving through here and I noticed there's so many fields with cattle and hay, and you get a little bit further south and you're going to see an awful lot of cotton and peanuts and some soybeans. And so I really do think, and I think that this is important to remember, that though there are people in the cities that tend to vote Democrat and have never seen a farm, have never been through, quote unquote, the flyover country, I think it's incredibly important for us to remember that, yeah, they may look their nose down at people like that, but if you were to actually take one of those people and have them try to survive in an environment where there were not the people producing their food and their fiber in states like Alabama, that those cities would immediately devolve into chaos and die. And I think it's so hilarious that the people in cities look down their nose at people in the country, people in farmland, that kind of thing, and then they wouldn't even be able to begin to have a similar lifestyle that they do if it were not for those people. And maybe I'm thinking about this because I'm a ag major and state convention for the Alabama FFA is coming up. But what it really all boils down to is that whether they appreciate it or not, whether or not they understand the relationship between their life and what they're doing and people in places like this that provide the lumber for the house that they live in or the building that they work in, and provide the cotton for their clothes and provide the food that goes on their table, they would quickly learn an appreciation once that stuff went away. Once they realized that the magic bread fairy doesn't just bring bread to the supermarket, that there are people involved in the growth and production and transportation of that, I think it would really paint it in a different light. And what I mean by that is, I don't think that it's productive for us to go out and talk about how silly and stupid they are and how ridiculous their position is on that, even though there's some truth to it. I think we do better catching more flies with honey than vinegar and explain to them and talk to them and educate them about the important role of Middle America to the rest of the world, to the rest of the economy. Because the reason that we are an economic powerhouse, the reason that we have so many people that don't have to be involved directly in growing their own food and wondering where their food's going to come from one day to the next, the best way to do that is through education and helping them to understand that that is an important part of it. So let's just try to come at it from a diplomatic perspective, and hopefully they'll be able to realize at that point that it's important for them to appreciate the American farm.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I really believe that we're at a crossroad, because I'm looking at these stories, and I do this every single day, looking through the news, trying to figure out what I'm going to talk about. And today I was really reminded of the opening of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I really believe that's true. I really believe that we right now are living in a time that in some ways is so encouraging and uplifting, and we're right on the cusp of a world that could be more free, more prosperous, more virtuous than any world that has ever come before us. And we also, at the same time, are on the cusp of a world that we could misuse all of the amazing things that are coming forward, and we could very quickly devolve into darkness. We could see a new dark age, not because we would have a lack of technology per se, but that the power would be in the hands of the wrong people. And in certain ways, there is some similarity between right now and the early 1900s at the start of the century. Because you look at what was going on in the early 19th century, especially post-World War I, and radio technology was developing, telephone technology was developing, TV was developing. We were having these massive, massive technological advances. Cars were becoming cheaper and more common. It was going to be easier for people in the outside the cities to be able to access them. It was going to be easier for middle class people to have all these luxuries. It was such an exciting, amazing time, and they were right there on the sidelines, right there, right over the hill before everything started to come together, and World War II happened. And so I don't know. I mean, it's just such a mixed feeling there, and I really found two stories that I think highlight that. And I wanted to present them to you because I'll go ahead because I want to end on a better note. I want you to look at all the darkness in the world, and this story really kind of hit home with that for me. There's a woman right now in the UK that is trying to sue a hospital and sue her doctors for what she calls a wrongful birth. So Edyata Mordell is suing a British hospital for $250,000 for the cost of raising her son, claiming that she experienced what's known as a wrongful birth. And what a wrongful birth is, she's saying that she should have aborted her own son. Her son, who is now 4 years old, has Down syndrome, and she assumed that a test had been done for Down syndrome when the doctors told her that it was all good, even though they offered her the test for Down syndrome earlier, and then she declined it, and then later they told her that she was perfectly healthy and her pregnancy was healthy. She had already foregone the test for Down syndrome, and she's saying had she thought that test had been administered to her because her doctors told her that the baby was perfectly healthy. She didn't know that she thought that even after she said no, that they had done it later or something. There's a little bit of a legal battle and trying to determine exactly whether she did know whether or not her son had Down syndrome. But what's so sad is that people are focusing on that and really thinking about that's the point. I read this and I was just, honestly, I was bummed for a pretty good stretch of time after it. I'm not talking about days, but I just sat there staring at my computer screen thinking, how can any woman, especially, look at her 4-year-old son and think, gosh, if only I had killed him when I had the chance? I mean, the level of lack of sympathy for any person, let alone your own child, your flesh and blood, and seeing that person and saying, man, this is just so inconvenient. If only I had killed him when I had the chance. That takes a soulless person. That takes somebody that has been so convinced by the world that their worldview is so skewed and so twisted. And I'm not blaming it on society itself. I am saying that society, unfortunately, says that that's okay and gives her license to do that, but she's the one that's making the decision. That our society is so backwards that, first of all, she thinks this is an okay thing to say, but anybody that their worldview is so twisted that they think that that is acceptable to say or acceptable to even think, I don't know how that person wakes up in the morning and looks at themselves in the mirror, really. And I get that raising a child with special needs is incredibly difficult. I don't know it because I've never done it myself. But I've known families that did, and the way that they take care of their children is nothing short of heroic. I mean, it takes a incredibly special person to take care of a person with special needs. It does. And I have close friends that have this situation. It takes an incredible amount of love and patience. I get that. But even if you had somebody that fell short in those areas, even if you had somebody that found it incredibly frustrating, and I'm sure everybody that has that situation at times gets frustrated or upset and ask why that happened, but to want the person to die because of your own inconvenience, that raises to a whole other level of apathy and sympathy for your fellow man. I don't see how anybody gets to that level. And it absolutely breaks my heart that there are people that look at that. I can't imagine anything more evil other than actually just killing your child yourself than seeing your child who is alive and wishing that you had killed them when there weren't going to be any legal penalties for it. Because do you know what that tells me? What that tells me about that person? Well, the only thing that's keeping me from killing my kid is the fact that the law doesn't allow it. Because when the law did allow it, I really wish that I had killed them then. Now I can't because it's illegal, so I guess I won't kill them. That's what this says. And part of the reason that line of thinking that she believes is okay and acceptable is because of the society that we've fostered that doesn't treat life as though it's sacred or meaningful for people inside the womb. That's where we are. And because of our advanced medical technology that allows us to predict very early on when a kid has Down syndrome, that's an amazing thing. Families can get prepared earlier. They can know what's happening. It's not nearly as much of a culture shock when the baby actually does come. That's a wonderful thing. But we're not using it for that. We're using it to determine, okay, well, if they got Down syndrome, they're going to be an awful lot to handle and they're going to be a handful, so I need to go ahead and get rid of that right now. You see the difference there? We have amazing medical advancements. And it kills me that the thing that people are using it for is to take the life of other people. I can't understand how someone gets to that point. But on the other side, the light side, and this is what I'm talking about, where I really do think that we're on the edge of what could be really amazing or really horrifying. On the other side of that, we're using technology to do really amazing things. There's this story that I pulled from Fox News. First baby in U.S. born to mother who received uterus from a deceased donor. So that's the headline. For the first time in the United States, a mother became pregnant and gave birth to a healthy baby after receiving a uterus transplant from a deceased donor. The Cleveland Clinic, which oversaw the transplant pregnancy and June birth as part of an ongoing clinical trial, said both the baby girl and the mother are, quote, doing great. We couldn't have asked for a better outcome, Uma Purney, MD, at the Cleveland Clinic maternal fetal specialist, said in a news release. It's important to remember this is still research. The field of uterus transplantation is rapidly evolving, and it's exciting to see what the options may be for women in the future. See, that's amazing. Just looking at that and reading that, you have to understand you can literally on one hand count the number of women that have had this procedure done to them in the U.S. Now, they've done uterus transplants before, but it's always been from another living woman. You take one woman that's alive, you take her uterus out, and you put it into another living woman. This is somebody who died, and you're doing an organ donation just like you did from a heart or a lung or something like that, just like you would a normal organ donor the way we usually think about it. That's incredible. And there have only been about, I think the number was 5 of all the women that have had this done, and that a woman was actually able to take a pregnancy to term and birth a healthy baby. I can't even describe how incredible that is. Because you think about it, as complex and amazing as something like a human heart or a human lung is, it doesn't grow another human. The female uterus is an incredibly complicated piece of equipment. And yet somehow, this uterus was transplanted and not only stayed alive, but was able to fulfill its function of creating an egg. And by the way, I have a whole other slew of questions genetically, which does that affect the DNA in any way? And if so, is the baby the woman's baby, or is it the baby of the woman whose uterus they transplanted it from? Because obviously that's another person's DNA. So I have a slew of questions on that, but nonetheless, I assume that it's genetically her child, the woman that actually gave birth, but I'm not sure. You can tell I'm not an OBGYN on this. But it's just amazing to me that this is taking place. And the story goes on. Babies born to women who have received a donated uterus have occurred in the U.S. before, but they have never involved a deceased donor. A research team in Brazil announced their country's first successful live birth following a uterine transplant from a deceased donor in 2018, which Dr. Rebecca Fleitklick, that's a bunch of consonants in one space, a reproductive endocrinologist at the Cleveland Clinic, said at the time was a really exciting moment. It's proof of concept that a deceased donor is a really good model, Fleitklick told Stat News. It's amazing how perfectly normal this delivery was, considering how extraordinary the occasion, said Andreas Tzaikius, MD, PhD, the clinic's transplant surgeon. Through this research, we aim to make these extraordinary events ordinary for the women who choose this operation. We are grateful to the donor and her family. Their generosity allowed our patient's dream to come true and a new baby to be born. Wow, we have a completely new person that was grown 100% in a womb that was taken out of a deceased woman and put into one that was living, and was able to give a woman that previously had no chance of conceiving whatsoever to taking a full-term pregnancy, and the way that they described it, not having any complications, everything went smooth. We are living in really, really amazing times, and we're making so many critical medical advancements. And I just cannot describe how, I guess, optimistic I am about this, which kind of surprises me. But even after reading this, I have to think about the way that we're using technology in this instance, an amazing way, and in the previous instance, in an incorrect way, or a way that brings death and pain, as opposed to something like this, which brings life and joy. And so it really does present this dichotomy of choosing good or choosing evil. It's not about the advancements, whether it's medical technology or any other technology. It's how you use it. And a perfect example of this is, can you imagine a world? Can you imagine a world where the big dictators who killed millions, Mussolini, Mao Zedong, Stalin, Hitler, can you imagine a world where those people had access to the level of technology that we have right now? Think about it. You know how hard it was for Hitler to round up Jews in Germany and Poland and all the other territories he took over. How easy would that have been if he had GPS? All he'd have to do is find all the Jews and microchip them. And then he could find them no matter where they went. I mean, you look at what's going on right now in China with Project Dragonfly. Imagine if Mao had had that level of technology. He could have killed millions of more people. You look at the Holodomor in Ukraine and what Stalin would have done if he had had better technology, better able to track people, better able to suppress people, better able to tamp down the resistance that he experienced in Ukraine. I mean, it really does make you shudder to think what people like this would have done with the way that everything's online now. People are incredibly easy to track. They're easy to find. Every aspect of your life can be monitored. 1984 will look like Paradise Island compared to the level of technology we have now. And that ought to terrify everybody to think that people with that kind of malice, people with that kind of wicked intent that want to control every aspect of somebody's life, now they have the tech to do it. And I am horrified thinking about what could happen if we don't get this right. If we don't keep the right people out of power. It only takes one. It only takes a slip up. It only takes one person taking over for this to all go downhill really fast and land us in another dark age. And so I guess that I wish I had a point to bring this all together, but I'm not sure that I do. Other than we have to very carefully consider what we're going to do next, because we get to live in the world that we choose. Whatever happens, whether we end up in a world of great freedom and light or great darkness and tyranny is going to be primarily dependent upon us. Now, maybe the crowd goes a different way and we don't get any say in it, and maybe we fight the good fight and we fail anyway. That might happen. I've considered that. But ultimately, it is the people that will decide what direction we wind up going in. And I pray that we have the wisdom to go in the right one. We must be more vigilant and more determined than ever to preserve liberty. Because as horrible as it was when different parts of the world lost liberty in the previous century, the results will be far more detrimental now that we're living in a new century with this new technology. We have got to get this right. All right, so now that I've hit you with that heavy load of bricks, let's go straight to the Daily Dose of Stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
All right, and today's Daily Dose of Stupid, I thought that we would do something kind of special. We are going to do yet another Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez week in review because, boy, AOC has had a stellar week. And so instead of doing so many Daily Doses of Stupid dedicated to her, I thought it was much easier to just do a week in review this week. So here's the first one. We'll go ahead and look at this. This is AOC's first tweet of the week. Catfight is the sexist term Republicans use when two adult women happen to disagree with each other. The reason they find it so novel and exciting is because GOP haven't elected enough women themselves to see that it can, in fact, be a normal occurrence in a functioning democracy. Okay, well, there's a number of stupid things in that tweet. First of all, we're not a democracy. And second of all, Republicans have elected quite a few women, but that was not what was going on here. It was a fight between Nancy Pelosi, an elected woman, and a person that was not elected, somebody that was appointed. Kellyanne Conway is a cabinet member. She is not an elected official. So a couple of things that were really dumb in that one, but I don't understand why she's saying it's sexist. Why would she say that the term catfight is sexist? What it means is two women that are fighting. So I guess now, according to AOC, that it's sexist to acknowledge a person is a woman. In other words, saying, hey, woman. Apparently now that's sexist. Because the only thing that catfight means is that the two people that are in conflict are two women. So logic would follow that I guess now it's sexist to say that someone's a woman. I guess that's the thing now, which, you know, according to some on the transgender side of the argument, I guess maybe it is. That just saying that someone's a woman means that you are a sexist. It doesn't make any sense, but, you know, when has AOC ever cared about that? So in response to this, you had Lisa Booth, a host over at Fox, say this. Yes, Kellyanne is sexist towards women. That makes total sense. Which, I mean, yeah, accurate. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But AOC responded with this. Just when you think all hope is lost, we get a Fox contributor to realize that the patriarchy has no gender. Yeah. So that's AOC's response. The patriarchy has no gender. I got some bad news for you, AOC. Patriarchy actually does have a gender. It by definition, has a gender. Let's look up the definition of patriarchy. Social organization marked by the supremacy of the father in the clan or the family, the legal dependence of wives and children, and the reckoning of descent and inheritance in the male line. Yeah, so the patriarchy, by definition, has a gender. In fact, that's all the patriarchy is about. Now, I don't know that we're living in a patriarchal system. I would make the argument that we're not, but even assume that we are, you can't say that the patriarchy doesn't have a gender. Because even the word patriarchy comes from the Greek term patar, meaning father. So patriarchy, yes, that does have a gender. Although maybe what's going on here is that AOC is actually practicing what she preaches, because we saw from her previous tweet, she assumes that merely referring to a woman as a woman, in other words, acknowledging that a person has a gender, is indeed sexist. So acknowledging that a father is a man, I guess, is also sexist. Or acknowledging that the patriarchy has anything to do with gender, that would of course be impossible if you don't acknowledge that there is such a thing as gender. So I guess AOC is actually correct in her own little worldview. That if it's now sexist to refer to somebody as a woman, and you would have to do that for the patriarchy to exist, then the patriarchy has no gender. So there you go. You figured it out. But no, as ridiculous and absurd as all of that is, and yes, it doesn't make any sense. I guess if she doesn't acknowledge that Booth or Conway are women, then she is at that point, she is no longer engaging in sexism. But here's really where it all goes down to, and we'll actually see this before this Daily Dose of Stupid dedicated to AOC winds up at the end of the day. The truth is, AOC is a one-trick pony. She knows how to do exactly one thing, which is anytime she is met with any kind of resistance or any blowback or anybody criticizes a point that she is trying to make, she is incapable of actually breaking the argument because she has no critical thinking skills whatsoever. And so she starts throwing out labels. If somebody attacks her, it's because they're sexist. It's because they're racist. It's because they don't like powerful women. It's something. But the point is, it can't possibly be because their argument was better. And you'll notice she never actually responds to the argument itself. She only responds to the person. In other words, if somebody breaks down the fact that her math is completely wrong on a policy proposal, her response to that is, yeah, you just hate women of color. That's all she can do. She is a one-trick pony. But now this next one, oddly enough, is stupid. And it does involve AOC. But really, AOC is just more of the medium in this one. And I promised you at the beginning of the show we would talk a little bit more about this. So the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, this, I guess it was Tuesday? Yeah, Tuesday. Ruled that Trump cannot block people on Twitter because Twitter is a public forum. Now, this is wrong for a myriad of reasons. First of all, it is a public space, but it is not a public forum. Twitter is definitely a public space. People can go onto Twitter. People can see Twitter. You don't need any money to access Twitter. So yes, it's a public space. It's just like your McDonald's or your Burger King or your Whataburger or, insert restaurant or store here. Clothing stores, same thing. It's a public space in the sense that the general public has access to it. It's not like a bar where you have to pay a cover charge. You walk into a general store just there on your street corner. That is a public space. That is not the same thing as a public forum. A public forum is something that the government does. The public forum is something that the government is putting out there saying that, okay, this is a public announcement, and what they're saying is the president as a government official is not allowed to, even on his personal account, exclude those that would want to hear it. In other words, as a broadcaster, because even though I don't necessarily agree with all this, I'm just telling you how it is, not necessarily how I envision it. The radio waves are governed by the FCC. And because the radio waves, even though we're a private company, you can't specifically block, for example, PSAs or emergency alerts from certain people. For example, let's just say that we really didn't like people in, I don't know, a particular town that's surrounding Montgomery. And we turned off our I don't even know how we would do this from a technological standpoint. I'm just giving the example. We decided we're going to turn off the signal to Wetumpka because we don't like people in Wetumpka. And so since we don't like people in Wetumpka and there's a flood coming to Wetumpka, we're going to turn off the PSA so that they can't hear that the emergency broadcast system is going to come over their airwaves. Yeah, that would be totally illegal. And there would be good reason for that. Because being used as a part of the emergency broadcast system, which is something that is provided by the government, it would be wrong for the FCC or a government agency to determine that we're going to broadcast this to surrounding places, but we're going to exclude a certain part of the population or even a single person. Again, I don't know how they would, from a technological standpoint, do that, but we're not going to block. We're going to keep that message from coming to those people. If that happened, the court would have been deciding correctly. But the thing is, it's Donald Trump's personal account. But their rationale was, but he announces things on his personal account. Well, if that's going to be your new standard, then nobody can ever block anybody if they are a public figure. If you are the county commissioner for Montgomery County or Otago County or Elmore County, you're not allowed to block somebody that you just don't like on your Twitter. If that's the standard we're going with, then that standard has to be applied to everybody. And so because of this, they have basically done the same thing to AOC. And the reason this is so absurd is Twitter is still a private company. This would be like a politician doing a fundraiser. And at that fundraiser, since it's a fundraiser, they keep certain people out. In other words, it's an invitation-only event. Let's say you rented out, I don't know, Coach's Corner in Wetumpka or the O'Charlie's in Prattville. Just give, a random example. Let's say you rented out that space. This would be like the court saying, no, you have to let everybody in because it's a public forum. But it's not. It's a private fundraiser. Well, yeah, but the thing is, you're going to be talking about policy issues and you can't keep certain people from hearing that. Therefore, you have to admit everybody in. But it's not even a government space. It's a private space that I'm personally renting. Now, is Trump paying for his Twitter account? No. But that's essentially what Twitter is. It is a space that has been created for people to use. And so the idea that they can say on this private company space that Trump has created a smaller space that he's basically renting out or using from Twitter, that he's not allowed to block certain people he doesn't like, that's absurd. Now, personally, even though I've never blocked anybody on Twitter for any reason, and I think that it's bad form because blocking people out for political reasons just because you happen to disagree with their whatever they're saying or disagree with their position, I think it's absurd personally, because then you build yourself a little echo chamber. And frankly, it should surprise absolutely no one that Trump wants to live in an echo chamber. But nonetheless, that's the problem that we're presented with here. And so the reason that this doesn't make sense is because, especially on Twitter, you can still read a person's tweets even after they've blocked you. You can either log out and search for their tweets when you're logged out, and you can see you can't tweet obviously, but you can see everything that they've tweeted. Or in Trump's case, you can just read the news, because everything the man tweets winds up on the evening news anyway. So I don't know why they're saying that people don't have access to the president's tweets because of this. That doesn't make any sense. But again, the court seemed to hold some kind of weird special animosity specifically for Trump. Because if you're being honest with yourself, you know that they would have never determined this if it were Barack Obama. And in certain ways, the opinion of the court kind of suggests that when they singled out the way that Trump uses Twitter specifically as part of their decision. But now New York State Representative Don Heidkind, who is a Democrat, and New York congressional candidate Joseph Saladino, I think is the way to say his name, they are both now suing AOC for blocking them on Twitter. Again, I think blocking people on Twitter is dumb, but even though this one actually isn't AOC's fault, it is interesting. Now we're going to see, is the law going to be applied fairly? Is it going to be applied to everyone equally? I have my doubts, but we'll see the way that the court decides this, because it seems to me that if they're blocking one, they'll have to block the other. Or sorry, if the court decides against Trump, they also have to decide against AOC and every other elected official. That would be the way that I would think that they would have to do it. But finally, and this is the big one, because this one actually has an Alabama tie-in, which we'll get to in a second. There is a cat fight, and I know that I'm a sexist now for using that term, but there is a cat fight between Nancy Pelosi and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And the whole thing started over a spending bill for emergency aid to the border. Pelosi voted in favor of it. AOC voted against it. Pelosi actually, even though that the House had failed several bills aimed at doing this beforehand because they couldn't agree with the Republicans, they finally did figure out a way to pass a bill, and there were enough Democrats that were able to get on board that it wound up passing and sending it to the Senate. And what's important to note about this is specifically to give aid to the kids at the border. This is the reason that this was put together, and improve their facilities so that it won't be as problematic, because we had a massive surge that was completely unexpected of unaccompanied minors and also children and adults in these holding facilities. And part of the reason that we're having some issues and some problems is because of the overcrowding, and specifically surprise overcrowding. As a result, Congress has deemed that it is necessary, and something that I actually agree with, this is something that the federal government is charged with doing, specifically in Article 4 of the Constitution. So because of that, the Democrats were able to side with the Republicans and say, look, we may not agree with each other much, but we do think that these kids are going to need beds and blankets and supplies, and because of that, we're willing to put our differences aside to put this spending bill together to spend on the illegal immigrant children being held in these facilities. AOC decided against that. But what's fascinating is that now AOC has come out against Nancy Pelosi on this. And the reasoning for AOC's no vote basically is a Monty Python sketch. I mean, it boils down to, hey, are you going to vote for the spending for the kids on the border? No, we must never side with the Republicans. Why, AOC? Why should we never side with the Republicans? Because they are evil and racist and have children in cages. But this bill would actually help remedy that. This bill would actually help the kids so that they could get out of cages, so they could have nicer facilities. But we must never side with the Republicans. Why? Because you see how this goes? That it just keeps going in a circle. None of it makes any sense. But this is the stance that AOC has decided to take. We will never side with Republicans no matter what they do. Even if they're doing something that we're specifically complaining about them not doing. And honestly, from a political perspective, I think that AOC might actually be in the right on this one. Not saying what she's doing is right, but if you're the Democrats and you're constantly undermining any attempts whatsoever to get new facilities built, all you have to do is point to how bad the facilities are and talk about how cruel and evil Republicans and Donald Trump are. It's a win for you on both sides. And so, I mean, yes, kids are, in trouble because of it, and they're having to sleep on the floor under security blankets. But what do you care? I mean, for you, it's all about winning the next election, so why does it matter? But anyway, that's the position that we find ourselves in, and because of this, Nancy Pelosi did an interview with the New York Times and said all these people have their public whatever and their Twitter world, but they didn't have any following. They're 4 people, and that's how many votes they got. Which is essentially true. When it came to this bill, that was about the way that it went. And she's saying that the woke left, the fresh faces like AOC, are doing something that makes absolutely no sense to essentially appease their Twitter followers. And the truth is, this is nothing new. Nancy Pelosi has been throwing shade sort of subtly at AOC for a long time. You may remember this clip from her earlier.
When we won this election, it wasn't in districts like mine or Alexandria's. However, she's a wonderful member of Congress. I think all of our colleagues will attest. But those are districts that are solidly Democratic. This glass of water would win with a D next to its name in those districts. And not to diminish the exuberance and the personality and the rest of Alexandria and the other members.
Which, I mean, is basically true. I don't often agree with Nancy Pelosi, but that's correct. In the district that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won, now, was it a big deal for her to win her primary? It was a moderately big deal. It was a guy that had been in office for a long time. But was winning her district a big? No. You could have literally put Ronald Reagan against a shoe with a D next to its name, and the shoe wins. That's the way that it works up there. In fact, you could even go the opposite direction. You could pick somebody that's a very left-leaning Republican, somebody like Mitt Romney, against a glass of water, like Nancy Pelosi said, and they would have won. She is correct in that. But the thing is, Nancy Pelosi has a tendency to kind of try to not throw shade and throw shade at the same time. And I think this comes from her being a grandma, because everybody knows the grandma insults are the worst ones. Like, your grandma looks at you and goes, "Hey, you look really good since you gained all that weight." And you're just there like, "Thanks, grandma." You know, it's kind of a backwards burn to where it burns you, but they're trying to phrase it in the form of a compliment. And that's what Pelosi did in that clip. And but now that's gone. Now she's not even pretending to try to ingratiate herself to them. Now she's just, the gloves came off and she's like, look, they live in their Twitter world. They listen to those people. They have, and that's the amount of votes that they got. And she's not wrong. Her and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and whoever the other one was from, I think, Minnesota. That's what happened. And Nancy Pelosi apparently pointing this out was a big problem. So AOC, in response to this, said in the Washington Post, and I quote, "When these comments first started, I kind of thought that she was keeping the more progressive flank at more of an arm's distance in order to protect the more moderate members, which I understood. But the persistent singling out, it got to a point where it was just outright disrespectful. The explicit singling out of newly elected women of color." So like I said earlier, AOC is a one-trick pony. She knows how to do exactly one thing. When somebody attacks her, she lashes out and she calls them a name. They're either sexist or racist or bigoted or whatever. It's literally the only thing she knows how to do. And because of that, when Nancy Pelosi kind of jabbed her a little bit, she jabbed back with the only thing that she knows how to do. Call her a racist. She can't call her a sexist because she's a woman. Oh wait, that makes AOC sexist because we just determined from her earlier tweet that saying someone is a woman is sexist. So I don't know what the rules are. AOC's the expert on that. You'll just have to ask her. But that's where we are right now. That the only thing that she could come up with to say against Nancy Pelosi in response to that was, well, I guess that it's because of my race. It's because they're women of color. And that's the reason that she is saying this, which it's absurd. What's going on here? The real divide, and I do think it's hilarious that she said specifically the more progressive members, when actually the divide here is between progressivism and socialism. Nancy Pelosi is a progressive. AOC is a socialist. A progressive is a socialist with a longer timer. What a progressive wants to do is turn a country socialist little by little, increment by increment, until all of a sudden you're a socialist country and you can't figure out how you got there. Socialists say, nope, burn it all down, we're starting over. That's the difference. AOC doesn't want to wait. She doesn't want to be patient. She wants to have everything that she wants right now because she's essentially a giant toddler. And Nancy Pelosi is the old guard, the experienced progressive, the experienced Democrat that's saying, we want the same thing. Let's get there gradually. And to point this out, Nancy Pelosi, the same woman who just yesterday was literally coaching illegal immigrants on national TV how not to get caught by ICE. This is not a woman that hates illegal immigrants. She is encouraging them to break the law. She's not against illegal immigration. She is merely against these facilities not having proper equipment to take care of the kids that are housed there. Which I guess is technically a point in her favor, even though it's not helping much. But I want to point out the irony of all this. Nancy Pelosi's stance is, I'm willing to work with the Republicans if it means that the Latino kids that are coming across the border get a bed and get a blanket and have plenty to eat. AOC is saying, no, not going to work with the Republicans no matter what it's for. So Nancy Pelosi is voting for beds and food for the Latino kids. AOC is saying, doesn't matter what it's for, I'm not voting with the Republicans. And yet, AOC is saying Nancy Pelosi, the one voting for the Latino kids' foods and beds, she's the racist and AOC isn't. That's how backwards AOC's mind works. But that's where we are now. And Terry Sewell of Alabama, our own Terry Sewell, actually weighed in on this. And remember that she's a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. She said, to even insinuate that I or any other member of the New Dems would promote policies that are racist and hateful or ones that would negatively impact communities of color is deeply offensive and couldn't be further from the truth. Now here's the thing. Is Terry Sewell, representative from Selma, is Terry Sewell correct? Yes. Terry Sewell is right to point out the absurdity of her claim. As I explained before, the divide is not over black or white, or in this case, white or Latino. And the divide is not there. The divide is progressive versus socialist. Nancy Pelosi is saying, let's play the political game, let's play the long game and get these policies through later. AOC is saying, nope, go for broke. I want what I want and I want it now. That's where the divide is. Terry Sewell is looking at that and saying, no, that's dumb. And Terry Sewell is right to point that out. However, the reason that it's hard to take from Terry Sewell is that Terry Sewell does this kind of stuff. She has used this exact same tactic before. I mean, you just look down at the history. She joined the Democrat censure denouncing Trump as a racist for saying that Haiti was a crappy country. He didn't use the word crappy. He used a different one, but I can't say that on the air. Was that a bad thing? Sure. But she specifically in that censure said, nope, Trump is a racist for saying that, even though there was no evidence of that whatsoever. She also accused John Merrill, our Secretary of State, of voter suppression specifically of black people, calling John Merrill a racist when there was zero evidence for it whatsoever, no reason to believe that he was trying to suppress black people from voting. Ironically, considering under his watch, our Department of State has recorded a record-breaking number of African Americans voting in the state of Alabama. So, despite that, Terry Sewell is still saying that he's trying to suppress black voters and accusing his department of racism. Terry Sewell also accused the entire state of racism merely for passing voter ID laws and the strong support that we had for him. Said that of our state legislature, our governor said that that was racist, accused them of racism in that. And Terry Sewell also said that electing judges, as opposed to having them appointed, was racist in 2016. Honestly, I think there's a good debate to have between elected and appointed judges. There's advantages and disadvantages to both. I think there's legitimate points on both sides. I'm fine with having that discussion. But the idea that Terry Sewell is saying the reason that they're doing this is because of racism, no, that's incredibly stupid. So, is Terry Sewell technically correct in this one issue, saying that AOC is way out of line and ridiculous for suggesting that Nancy Pelosi hates people of color? Yes, she is 100% right for doing that. But the thing is, Terry Sewell has done that before in the past, so it's kind of hard to take that criticism coming from Representative Sewell. All right, let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's Report today does come from the book of Daniel, and we're going to be wrapping up our study on Daniel pretty quickly. We're already about halfway through the 10th chapter, and there's only 12 chapters. So today's reading comes from Daniel 10, verses 15 through 17, and remember that this is after Daniel has received the vision. He's been praying, he's been fasting, his body is very weak. And then we see this passage from Daniel 10, 15 through 17. When he had spoken to me according to these words, I turned my face toward the ground and became speechless. And behold, one who resembled a human being was touching my lips. Then I opened my mouth and spoke and said to him who was standing before me, O my Lord, as a result of the vision of anguish has come upon me, and I have retained no strength. For how can such a servant of my Lord talk with such a man, such as my Lord? As for me, there remains just now no strength within me, nor has any breath been left in me. Now, one thing that's interesting to point out about this particular passage is that Daniel is completely drained. This is not surprising. Daniel has just gone through 21 days of fasting. He has presumably eaten nothing substantial. He said that I have taken in no tasty food. Now that may mean he's eaten no food at all, or he has eaten some things, but he's not eaten anything that would slate his hunger very much. So he's basically just trying to stay alive and absolutely nothing more. And this is somebody who has been praying for that entire time, in intense spiritual and physical praying. And so because of that, he spent. Daniel is essentially saying, I am too exhausted, and then once I felt the vision come upon me, that did even more to me, and I am completely drained. I don't even really have the strength to engage in conversation with you anymore. And so when you look back at that passage, he talks about his strength has left him, that the vision of anguish has come upon him, he has retained no strength, and he is saying that there is no breath left in me. He's having trouble breathing. He's so tired and hungry. And I want you to notice something. That when you look at that and sort of cross-reference it with other experiences that people have had close to God. When you look at Moses and his face shining so bright when he had seen God's face that they had to put a veil over his face just so they could see him. That you look at how he had reacted to the burning bush. That when you look at how David had prayed and fasted, asking for forgiveness after the sin with Bathsheba had been found out. You see, when people really put their spirit on the line, when they really pour out their heart to God in the Old Testament, and in the New as well, looking at the way that Jesus prayed and fasted, and some of the indication we get from John and Revelation as well, that their strength leaves them, that they are spent when that happens. And I think that speaks to the amazing power of God, but I think it also speaks to the way that the lengths that they are willing to go to. I think that that's important, and maybe something that we've lost a little bit in our society. When was the last time that you prayed to the point to where you were done and you were like, man, I am spent. I am tired after praying. Because I know I don't do that nearly enough. And maybe, looking at the way that Daniel prays, and prays fervently, we look at and admire, and rightfully so, the things that Daniel said in his prayer, the things that he was able to accomplish, his gifts. If we want to pray like Daniel, we have to pay a price. If we want to pray like Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane, or in any of the other trials where he went off for hours at a time to pray with God, if we want to be able to pray like some of the famous prayers in the Scripture, we have to be willing not only to expose ourselves completely to God and to be completely open with him, but we also have to be willing to forego our own comfort. And sometimes it helps to do a little fasting beforehand. I think if we want the deep kind of connection to God that they had, we have to be more willing to put ourselves on the line as they did. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.